Give us your connection with the church and faith and Christian faith.
Yeah, I did not grow up in a Christian home, and I didn't go to church growing up. And then I actually was raised, though I live in Houston, I was raised in the Pacific Northwest in the Portland, Oregon area. It's a very different culture, and I have to explain that many times. It's not this Christian saturated culture that you sort of get here in the southern United States. It was a very different, church was very private in the Northwest if you did go to church, and we didn't have churches on every street corner. And I sort of like to tease people and say, you know, down here in Texas, we have not only churches on every street corner, but we have Tex-Mex restaurants and gas stations on every street corner. It's so different from where I grew up. You actually had to look to find where the churches were. So it's just not flooded with Christian influence. And then I wasn't raised in church. In fact, I was raised in a home that valued the scientific endeavor. We watched a lot of science shows. We watched a lot of nature shows. And so my background, though, it was steeped in education and culture. I'm a musician. It wasn't steeped in a deep understanding of the Christian faith. In fact, I never went to church.
So if I said to you then, what do you think of Christian or faith or belief, what would you have said?
I don't know. I would have said, I don't know.
Okay.
In fact, I've said, if somebody were to ask me directly, are you saved? I would have said, saved from what? I wouldn't have understand what you were talking about. So my connection to Christianity came as a result of a band director, a high school band director that I viewed kind of like another father of mine. You know, I'm a musician. I was in the band, and I ended up teaching band in the public schools. So he actually witnessed to me. He actually, in my senior year, gave me a Bible and said, Mary Jo, when you go off to college, you're going to have some hard questions, and I hope you'll turn to this. And that was the extent of it. And at that moment in my life, I had some very tough questions, like, is this all there is? Am I really just a collection of atoms in a vast and different universe? Because that's what I'd learned, and that's my upbringing. And I started to have questions about meaning and purpose for my life. And he came in at just the right time and said, hey, you're going to have tough questions. I hope you'll turn to this.
So did you start reading it?
I did start reading it. I started reading, it was a NIV 1 year, so I had a plan for every day. And the thing that was exciting to me is as I started reading through these days, I realized that Christianity was not what I'd seen on TV. It was not as it's portrayed in the movies. It was so much more. And it was from reading the Bible, I started to get a deeper understanding and realize that I had a very shallow view of the Christian faith. And so I actually sped through, like I couldn't just read the day, that day's reading. I sped through it, and reading through that Bible brought me around to belief in God. It didn't get me all the way to Jesus, though, which is, I think it's kind of funny. I was reading about the salvation of Jesus Christ, but it didn't get me there.
Wow. So what did get you there?
Well, I went off to college on my own and without, my family nearby. I moved halfway across the United States to go to school. And I thought, you know what, this is my chance to go and figure out what this church thing is all about and what people have to say about belief in God. And so I started going to churches on my own. And it was when I finally got to a church where I heard what Christians would say is the good news, where I heard and understood my position as being in need of a Savior. And once I understood what Jesus did for me, once I understood that he was the Savior, that's when I trusted in him for my own salvation.
It's a long way from there to sort of teaching other people about it. What got you into the area of defending faith?
Yeah, it is a long way. Yeah, so after becoming a Christian, I got involved with ministry really fast. I had actually met my husband, we had gotten married, and we decided to take over a youth group. That sounds funny, take over a youth group, right? We decided to fill in, and then we became full-time in ministry. And what I saw then was that I saw Christians who were behaving very contrary to what the New Testament was actually teaching about how we're supposed to treat one another and the love, grace, and mercy of the Lord and how we're supposed to share it with one another. In fact, it was so different from my friends growing up. It was so much more ugly than some of my atheist, agnostic friends, the things that happened to us and the things that people would say, that I began to see a problem. I began to see that though there were people professing Jesus was a savior, that God was real, that the Bible was true, I wasn't seeing a lot of acting that way. So it was sort of like a disconnect. And I began to question, are there real believers in God? Now, of course, I'm not looking out over time in history, right? I'm looking at what's right in front of me. And I'm saying, wow, I'm not seeing real belief here. And then I started, that emotional doubt that was welling up in me started causing me to say, and why do I believe? What are my reasons for belief in God? And I started to realize I didn't have much to go on. And so that sort of inward, like looking at myself, why do I say I believe in God? That led me out to this field of defense of the faith. I actually didn't mean to get into it. I just went to answer, how do I know Jesus rose from the dead? How do I know God exists? And I started reading works on those questions. I started watching debates, between Christians and atheist philosophers. And that brought me back around to this position of, hey, not only do I believe in God, but I bet other people have doubt. I bet other people would like to know this information. So I began to teach it in my local church.
We wanted to explore that area of what gives you confidence and in faith and belief in the person of Jesus. So what gives you confidence in the New Testament and the stories of Jesus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what gives me confidence that Jesus was basically a real person and that he resurrected from the dead was, as I was exploring the defense of the faith, I found that I could trust, for one, the authors of the New Testament. I found that these authors had no motive to dismiss their testimony. They weren't gaining power. There was no lust involved. There was no money that they got out of this. And so the New Testament authors, I found myself saying, I have no reason to distrust what they're writing. And in fact, one of the passages that really impacted me, even when I was not a believer, was the passage from Luke 1, where he clearly states his purpose for writing, which is that he checked all these things out. He investigated all these things so that he could report back to Theophilus that, the certainty of the things that he had been taught. So that really impacted me. Here, this guy is saying, this is actually why I'm writing it. So I have no motive to distrust him. And that was one of the things that impacted me. I could actually trust these documents. Another thing that impacted me was the evidence of Jesus's death and life, the evidence surrounding that. And I found Gary Habermas's work on the minimal facts argument. And he just surveyed a bunch of scholars writing on the resurrection from 1975 to the present, and in French, German, and English. And he found that there was an agreement that these scholars had actually found things that they said were factual about Jesus's life, whether they were atheists, they had liberal theology, they had conservative theology. It was just across the board. These were the facts. And the minimal facts, he had like 12, right? So that's a lot. But the minimal facts were that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. And so one of the things that impressed me about this is you can't die by Roman crucifixion if you're not a real person. Right? And this fact alone is one of the most historical facts that we have about any ancient person. And that's really impressive. Like, we can actually know he was a person who died.
Because just in that area, the truth of that is not just in what's written in the Bible, is it? There are other people that were writing at that time who point to the same piece of information. Yeah, who point to specifically Jesus's death. You have outside sources. In fact, you have Suetonius, I don't know if he's specifically writing on Jesus' death, but Tacitus. You have a bunch of people from this era, Lucian of Samosata, Mara Bar Serapion. These are people who are writing within that time frame about Jesus as a person. And some of them mention his death as well. Some of them mention that his disciples were teaching he was the Messiah. And they mention it as, and that was erroneous, right? That's what they're saying. So these people aren't agreeing with what they're writing. They're just pointing to this person's history. Right, like Josephus, the Jewish scholar, and he's pointing towards, Tacitus, I mentioned, he's one of them, if not the greatest Roman historian, and he mentions Jesus. So, I found that Jesus was a real person. And one of the ways I found that was that he died by Roman crucifixion. And this is something that we can know from ancient history. What really impressed me
was that if you say, no, I don't believe that, it was a legend or a myth, by the criteria you're using to do that, you actually have to get rid of much else in ancient history. You have to get rid of a lot of other knowledge. And I don't know that people understand that when they get rid of just that Jesus was a real person, that he died by Roman crucifixion, that by the criteria, you're just getting rid of most of what the other sources that we have for other individuals like Tiberius Caesar and Emperor Augustus. So that was very impressive to me. And then that Jesus' disciples believed that they had had an experience with the risen Jesus, and that changed their life. They go from these frightened, hiding individuals who are denying Jesus, running away at his death, to coming back to proclaiming Jesus as the risen Lord in that area in which he had been put to death. And upon pain of death, right? They're told to disperse, do not call this guy the Messiah, no more preaching of this, or we'll put you to death. And that's the environment that they're saying Jesus had risen from the dead. And they're willing to go to their deaths for that, for something they know would be a lie if they were just making it up. So that's another one of the minimal facts that really impressed me about that there was a man named Jesus who lived, died, and then apparently rose from the dead.
Mary Jo, we're going to come back to those areas about what Jesus left and the disciples, but in the records that you're referring to, there's sometimes some disagreement between them. How did you handle that as you were discovering or looking at the veracity of the Bible?
Disagreement in the documents from the New Testament. Yeah, that's actually a great point. And it's something that Christians they need to understand, that there are reports that seem like they don't match up. And one of the ways that I came to understand, what actually is going on is first that, we don't report things in the 20th and 21st century like they did in the first century or in ancient times. We expect it to be completely accurate, match up, no personal influence on it and our way of seeing the story. We want it objective. Not that we always get that in our day and age, but that's what we're saying we want. And that's just not a realistic perspective for the context of the ancient culture and the environment in which they're giving. They're giving their testimonies about this in a way that is traditional for them. That was one thing. The other thing was that in reading a great book called Cold Case Christianity by Jim Warner Wallace, I love the way, he's a homicide detective who does cold cases, I guess is what he does. So he started looking at the Gospels and their reportage of the events in the way that he would look at one of his cases. And what he found, and I thought this was amazing, I don't know why I never thought of this myself, was that if he gets a group of 4 people together to get their testimony on a case, what did you see, what happened? If they give the exact same report, as a detective, he's gonna say, there's something fishy here. Like this looks conspiracy theorist, right? They all got together, they all told each other what they had seen, and now it's coming out exactly the same way. And he said, the fact that the Gospels are told in different ways from different perspectives to where I don't have an exact report, but I do get the same story overall, he says that actually gives me veracity, that these are individuals telling the story according to how they experienced them. And this is what you would expect from eyewitness testimony, is that you get little variances according to their own purposes for how they saw things, what they want to highlight. And he says that actually verifies it rather than gives him cause to say, no, this is all made up or whatever. It's if they reported it exactly the same way that he said he would have cause to think, this looks fishy. And I think that's a great way of explaining, without going into each individual instance, it's a great way of looking at it.
Somebody has also said, or numbers of people have said, that some of the smaller side pieces change, but the serious facts don't change.
They don't, yeah. The serious facts about Jesus' stories, his what he taught, the basic philosophy that comes out of it, his his death, his resurrection. These are all the same. It does not change, and that's very important because when you look in history at made-up stories. Right? You look through, these stories were written by authors that are they're fantasy, they're fictitious. You don't get figures like Jesus Christ coming from 4 separate authors. If you're just looking at the Gospels, there's more as you broaden out to the letters of the New Testament. But you don't get 4 different individuals creating the same enduring character at the same time frame that people follow for ages. You don't see that throughout history. In fact, you see works of genius coming very infrequently, and one here and one there. So like Shakespeare or Charles Dickens, and we don't even look at their characters as real people, right? We don't think, hey, this is a real person. But when you look at what happens with the Gospels, you've got 4 writers and more, and they're all coming up with the same story, the same character of Jesus Christ, and it impacts people in a way that you have to consider. These would be geniuses, right? These would be geniuses as authors. And that's not one of my arguments. It's another argument I encountered from John Lennox, talking about just looking at literature, you don't get this kind of figure developed over time in history, not at the same time concentrated in the same era by all these authors. So it's really hard to view it as fictitious, because it would take almost a miracle for something like that to happen.
Looking at what Jesus left, and you talked before about the disciples being afraid, unsure, not sure of the future. Odd question, but what did Jesus leave? Because he didn't leave a great deal, did he?
He didn't leave it. He didn't have an inheritance to leave behind as far as material things. But what he left behind was a group of individuals who were they were convinced that he was the Son of God. They were convinced that he had brought forth a new era of redemption for mankind. They were convinced that the kingdom of heaven had come to earth. And they were willing to go to their deaths to give other people what they believed was the truth about about reality of this universe, that Jesus had come in for salvation of mankind. And we could talk about what did he leave behind. That is the great inheritance that he left in this small group of individuals who then went out and shared it with the world.
There were other religious leaders at the time, other Messiah figures, and even through history. How does Jesus kind of compare to, or how is he different from other religious leaders?
Jesus is very different from other religious leaders. And I think the big point that we need to look at is that he resurrected from the dead. It's resurrection that sets him apart. So Jesus not only was a great teacher, a prophet, whatever you want to call him, but he also predicted his own death and resurrection, and then those things came to pass. And that's what the letters of the New Testament are telling us. That's what they're testifying to and giving us eyewitness testimony that he was dead, but now he's alive. I've seen him myself. And so one of the main differences is that great and important doctrine of resurrection, which is the foundation of the Christian faith.
There was, as we said before, there wasn't a lot except for this idea of a small group of people who were following Jesus in a backwater, really. Within 300 years, they've become the religion of the empire. What do you put that down to?
I put that down to the fact that it was an entirely different worldview, and it was a worldview of unconditional love and radical tolerance that we see Jesus preaching in Luke 6. Do good to those who don't do good to you. Love your enemies. And this sort of teaching was it was revolutionary. Jesus even mentions, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And isn't that the way of the world? But he comes back and says, but I tell you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you, who persecute you, who don't do good to you. And the reason that this is so important, and the reason why I think it spread, was because that is tolerance. That is acceptance. That's unconditional love. And when people get a hold of that, that's how it's supposed to be, right? This thing that we're looking for, the desire of our heart to be accepted and loved just as we are for who we are, this is what Jesus is teaching, and it radically transforms people.
One of the things that might surprise people kind of in our modern era, if we can put it in those terms, is actually how Jesus taught women. and how Jesus treated women. From your perspective as a woman looking at that, how did Jesus treat women that was perhaps different?
Yeah, I think that's really important because you're dealing with a time frame in which women were objects. They were objects of possession. They were objects of sexual desire. And, you don't teach them, therefore domestication. And here comes Jesus on the scene. Not only bringing women disciples along with him, but directly teaching women, which is contrary to his culture. The scene with Mary and Martha, I love that because Martha's doing what the culture expects of her. She's cooking, she's cleaning, she's doing all that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but then she pipes up and says, "Hey, look at Mary. Tell her to come help me." And Jesus tells her, "You know what? Mary has chosen what is better. It's not going to be taken from her." I think that's just revolutionary here. I'm going to continue to let her sit at my feet and learn theology, philosophy. Because she has a mind. God has given her a rational mind that needs developed. And look what she's doing. She's sitting here and learning from the greatest teacher who ever lived. It's not going to be taken away from her. Wow, what a statement that she's not just an object, to be used. But she is a subject. She's a human being to be loved, to be poured into. And I think that's the major change that you see with how Jesus interacts with women.
One of the stories about Jesus' resurrection was that the first person to see him was actually a woman. Why was that important?
Oh, I think that's very important in that, I've done some work in Islam and I've contrasted this. In Islam, the testimony of a woman is worth half that of a man, and that's said very plainly by Muhammad. But when you look at Christianity, the foundational doctrine of resurrection, that's the basis of the Christian faith. The first testifiers to that doctrine are women. And God trusts women, and he trusts their testimony. And that's a big contrast, not only to their culture, but also against Islam and that culture.
In our culture, the church and the teaching of the church is almost seen as negative towards women, second-class citizens. As somebody leading and teaching in the church, how do you see that?
I see that if you go back towards the way that Jesus viewed women. Again, God made women with a rational mind. We're made in the image of God, and I see Jesus as respecting women for their minds and being willing to teach them and being willing to lift them up. And so, yes, there has been some of that in our past, and I think we need to get back to the way that Jesus viewed women, that she is of immense worth and value as a human being. Great line from Jesus when he's asked by the Sadducees who are trying to trap him in Matthew 22. They say, there's a woman who's been married to several men, and, when she dies, because, that is the brothers kept marrying her over and over because that was the custom. And then the Sadducee says to Jesus, when she dies, to whom will she be married in heaven? And Jesus said, first he said, you err because you do not know the scripture nor the power of God, because he knew you were trying to trap him. But then he says, men and women are not given in marriage in heaven. And I think that's interesting that the thing that survives, the thing that carries on for both men and women is not this marriage relationship. It's our relationship with Jesus Christ. So him viewing us as an individual. So I always try to stress the Christian woman as a Christian, right? Because this is what is going to survive into the afterlife.
So that's an interesting piece, because we tend to see that as a kind of a teaching about the afterlife. But you're saying it's actually teaching about the importance and place of woman next to a man.
I don't know if it's specifically trying to do that, but I think it's interesting that we do have this marriage relationship here on earth, which I think reflects a picture of the Christ and his bride, and it reflects the gospel here and now, but it doesn't carry on into the afterlife. So I think it's an interesting note that we're not given in marriage in heaven. I think that's about as far as you can go, but yeah.
Mary Jo, this series is called Jesus the Game Changer. So how do you see Jesus as a game changer?
I think for most people, they've learned to live in this world full of evil and pain and suffering. And they almost don't see that there's any way out. and we're being taught more and more that this is all there is. There's nothing else. You live, you die, that's it. Jesus is the game changer because he comes in and says, no, that's not all there is. There is much more. You were created to be in relationship with God. You were created by God, and when he's done creating, he says, it's very good. And I think that's a very hard concept for people to understand. So what Jesus has done is he has come and changed the game. You're not meant for destruction. You're meant for redemption. What Jesus does is he truly sets us free. He comes to defeat the consequence of our evil, does so, and truly frees us up. So Jesus is a game changer because he sets us free.
Pulling me out.